The Turner household sat in eerie silence under the pale glow of the moon, the faint hum of distant crickets the only sound in the night. Inside, Margaret Turner was alone, perched on the edge of her threadbare couch. Her eyes darted to the clock. 2:13 a.m. She couldn't sleep, not that she ever could lately. The room felt heavier than usual, the shadows in the corners darker and more oppressive. She froze when the front door creaked. It opened just a crack, letting in a sliver of the cold autumn air. Margaret's heart raced. She reached for her phone but didn't dare move. Then he stepped inside. The boy was soaked to the bone, his drenched sneakers leaving small puddles on the wood floor. His hair clung to his pale face and his hoodie sagged under the weight of the rain. But his face? Margaret's breath caught in her throat tone. It was Ethan. It was her son. "Mom," he said in a voice that sounded far away, like it had traveled through a tunnel before reaching her ears. Margaret was frozen between disbelief and overwhelming relief. 4 months. 4 unbearable months since her only child had vanished on prom night, leaving a cavernous void in her heart. And now here he was, alive, right in front of her. She surged toward him, arms outstretched, her vision blurring with tears. But when she hugged him, she stopped short. His skin was icy, his soaked clothes clammy against her hands. He didn't smell like Ethan. There was no hint of the woodsy cologne he always wore or the laundry detergent she used. There was only damp earth and something faintly metallic. His arms stayed limp at his sides, making no move to embrace her. Margaret stepped back, her joy faltering. "Ethan, where have you been?" she stammered, her voice cracking. He didn't answer. His gaze drifted past her, landing on the dark hallway behind her as though he were looking for something, or someone. His lips twitched into a faint, unconvincing smile. "I'm home," he said simply. The words should have been comforting, but something in his tone chilled Margaret to the bone. He sounded detached, like someone rehearsing a line from a script they barely understood. And his eyes, those eyes were not her Ethan's. There was no spark of recognition, no warmth, only a vacant emptiness that made Margaret take an involuntary step back. The room felt colder, the weight of the shadows pressing closer around them. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked, trying to mask the tremble in her voice. "Let me get you some dry clothes." Ethan tilted his head, as if considering her offer before nodding slowly. "Okay." As Margaret moved toward the hallway, her stomach churned with unease. She glanced back and saw him standing completely still, his head bowed slightly, his wet hair hiding his face. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw his lips moving, whispering something she couldn't hear. Her hand tightened on the banister. She hesitated, suddenly unsure if she was leaving him alone in the room or if she was the one stepping into the unknown. Margaret sat at the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she cradled a steaming mug of tea. The house was quieter than usual, the kind of silence that amplified every creak and groan of the aging walls. In the living room, Ethan, or the boy who claimed to be Ethan, sat motionless on the couch, his shadow stretching unnaturally long against the flickering glow of the television. She stared at the faint reflection of her face in the tea, her mind racing back to 4 months ago. It was supposed to have been one of the happiest nights of Ethan's life, prom night. Margaret had insisted on snapping a dozen pictures of him in his suit before he left. He'd rolled his eyes, but humored her, flashing that lopsided grin that always made her heart swell. "Mom, it's just prom," he'd said, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I'll be back before you know it." But Ethan never came back. The hours ticked by that night, and her worry turned to panic. The police found his car abandoned near a stretch of woods on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. Doors locked, keys still in the ignition. No footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. It was as if he had stepped out of the car and vanished into thin air. The entire town had rallied behind her during those first few weeks. Search parties scoured the woods, volunteers posted flyers on every lamppost, and the local news aired his picture daily. But as the weeks turned into months, hope dwindled. Friends stopped calling as often. The search efforts grew sparse, and Margaret was left to endure the hollow ache of her empty home alone. She had refused to pack away Ethan's things, clinging to the faint hope that he would come back. His room was exactly as he had left it. Textbooks scattered on the desk, a pile of clean laundry at the foot of his bed, and his favorite baseball cap hanging on the corner of the chair. But the person now sitting in her living room wasn't the same boy who had worn that cap. Margaret's hands tightened around the mug. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The boy looked like Ethan, but there were gaps in his memories, inconsistencies that gnawed at her sanity. He talked about school friends Margaret had never heard of, mentioned places that didn't exist in Cedar Falls, and described moments from his childhood that she had no recollection of. "Do you remember your 9th birthday?" she had asked him earlier that day, desperate to bridge the growing chasm between them. Ethan had tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, of course, we went to that lake. What was it called?" He had trailed off, his gaze distant. "We didn't go to a lake," Margaret had whispered. "You wanted a dinosaur cake, so I made one. We spent the whole day at home." Ethan's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Right, that's what I meant." The exchange had left Margaret cold. She wasn't sure if she was losing her mind or if this was some cruel trick played by the universe. Maybe it was grief, she thought. Maybe her longing to see Ethan again was clouding her judgment. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Margaret set her mug down and rose to her feet, peering out at the darkened street. The neighborhood, so familiar and unchanging, now felt foreign and menacing. She had lived here for years, knew every house and every neighbor, but tonight, under the pale moonlight, it all seemed off. When she turned back to check on Ethan, she found him standing in the middle of the room, staring at her with an intensity that made her heart pound. His lips moved as if he were saying something, but no sound came out. "Ethan?" she called out hesitantly. He blinked and smiled faintly. "I'm just glad to be home, Mom." The words sent a chill down her spine. They were the exact words he had said the night he disappeared. The exact same tone, the exact same pause. Margaret's mind churned with questions. What had happened to her son? And if this wasn't her Ethan, if this boy wasn't truly hers, then who or what had come back? Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the doorway, listening to the creaks and groans of the house. The boy, Ethan, had gone to bed hours earlier, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, she found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly out the window. The cereal in his bowl was untouched, and the spoon dangled limply in his hand. His clothes, dry now, still clung to him awkwardly, as though they didn't quite belong on his frame. "Morning, sweetheart," Margaret said cautiously, her voice trembling, despite her best efforts to sound calm. "Morning, Mom," he replied, but his tone was flat, devoid of any warmth or familiarity. He didn't look at her. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands trembling as she gripped the pot. She had to keep herself together, had to make sense of what was happening. "Do you want to talk about where you've been, these last 4 months?" Ethan finally turned to her. His eyes, those eyes that used to sparkle with mischief and curiosity, were dull, almost lifeless. "I told you," he said quietly. "I was just away. I don't remember much." The vagueness of his answer made her stomach churn. "Away where? With who?" "I don't know." He paused, frowning slightly. "It's hard to explain." Margaret sat down across from him, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Try." Ethan tilted his head as if considering her words. "I was in this place. It was dark, quiet, but it felt like home." He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers. "I think I wasn't supposed to leave." The cryptic response sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. "Ethan, you're not making any sense." "I know," he said simply, his voice detached. "I'm sorry." Later that day, Margaret tried to distract herself by focusing on mundane tasks, but everything felt surreal. She couldn't shake the eerie feeling of being watched, even when she was alone. When she walked past Ethan's room, she noticed the door was slightly ajar. Inside, he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, his back to her, holding a photograph. Margaret's heart clenched. It was one of her favorite pictures of Ethan, taken when he was 8 years old at a summer camp in Wisconsin. She hadn't seen that photo in years, yet here it was, clutched in his hands. "Where did you find that?" she asked, stepping into the room. Ethan didn't turn around. "It was in the drawer," he said, his voice faint. Margaret frowned. "I don't remember putting it there." He finally looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever feel like you've lived a different life? Like this isn't the one you're supposed to be in?" The question took her off guard. "What do you mean?" Ethan's gaze drifted back to the photograph. I don't think I belong here. Her blood ran cold. Ethan, what are you saying? I remember things that aren't real, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I remember you, but not like this. And I remember places, people, but they're all wrong. He finally looked at her, and the despair in his eyes was almost unbearable. Mom, I don't know who I am. Margaret's breath hitched. Of course you do. You're my son. You're Ethan. He shook his head slowly. I'm not anymore. The words hung in the air like a death knell. Margaret wanted to deny it, to scream that he was wrong, but the sinking feeling in her gut wouldn't let her. Something was terribly, irreparably wrong. Over the next few days, the oddities grew more pronounced. Ethan would talk about places she had never been, people she had never met. He mentioned a summer vacation to Florida, a trip they had never taken. He hummed a tune one evening that Margaret didn't recognize, claiming it was a song she used to sing to him as a child. And then there were the moments of stillness. Sometimes Margaret would find him standing in the middle of a room, staring blankly at nothing, his lips moving soundlessly. Other times he would sit in complete silence, as if listening to something only he could hear. Margaret tried to convince herself that this was just the trauma of his disappearance, that his mind had fractured under the weight of whatever he had endured. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't her son, not really. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard the faint sound of whispering coming from the hallway. Her heart raced as she crept out of bed and tiptoed to the door. Ethan was standing there in the darkness, his back to her, his head slightly tilted. Ethan, she whispered. He turned slowly, his eyes reflecting the dim glow of the nightlight in the hallway. His lips parted in a faint smile. I was just checking the locks, he said. I don't want anything to get in. Margaret swallowed hard. What do you mean? Ethan's smile faltered. It's already inside. Margaret's world unraveled thread by thread in the days that followed. She began to notice things, small, almost imperceptible at first, but impossible to ignore. The kitchen light flickered erratically, though it had worked perfectly for years. Doors she distinctly remembered locking were found ajar. And then there were the sounds, soft whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls, low and unintelligible, just on the edge of hearing. Ethan, or whatever had returned in his place, grew stranger by the day. His behaviors were increasingly erratic, his mood shifting unpredictably. One moment he was silent and withdrawn, staring out the window with a vacant expression. The next, he was uncharacteristically animated, speaking of events and people Margaret didn't recognize. Do you remember Mr. Carver? He asked one evening, his voice light, almost cheerful. Margaret shook her head, her hands trembling as she set down her mug of tea. No, who's Mr. Carver? Ethan smiled faintly, his eyes unfocused. He lived next door when I was little, always used to fix things around the house. He was kind, until he wasn't. Margaret's blood ran cold. There had never been a Mr. Carver. She would have remembered someone like that. Ethan, she said softly, I think you might be confused. We've never had a neighbor named Carver. Ethan's smile didn't waver, but something in his expression darkened. Maybe you just don't remember, Mom. Not everything stays. The cryptic statement sent a chill down her spine, and she couldn't bring herself to press him further. The nights became unbearable. Margaret barely slept, haunted by the feeling of being watched. The shadows in the corners of her room seemed to stretch and shift, and the faint whispers that had started in the walls were now louder, more insistent. Sometimes they almost sounded like Ethan's voice. One evening, Margaret was jolted awake by the sound of laughter. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. It wasn't a joyous sound, it was hollow, echoing unnaturally through the house. She found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. A single candle flickered between them, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. What are you doing? She asked, her voice shaking. Ethan didn't look up. Talking, he said simply. Talking to who? He tilted his head, his eyes catching the candlelight in a way that made them seem almost reflective. They don't have names. Margaret's knees weakened, and she gripped the counter for support. Ethan, this isn't funny. Who were you talking to? Ethan finally looked up at her, his expression unreadable. They said you wouldn't understand. The tension in the air was suffocating, and Margaret could feel her grip on reality slipping. She tried to reach out to others, desperate for validation that she wasn't losing her mind. She called Jessica Miller, her closest friend, but the conversation did little to ease her fears. "Margaret, you've been through so much," Jessica said gently. "It's natural to feel unsettled. Ethan's been through a trauma, you both have. Maybe you should talk to someone, a therapist." Margaret wanted to scream. How could she explain the things she was seeing, the things Ethan was saying without sounding insane? Even Detective Laura Simmons, who had been so supportive during Ethan's disappearance, seemed skeptical when Margaret brought up her concerns. "He's been through a lot," Simmons said carefully. "Give him time to adjust. And maybe you should get some rest, Margaret. You look exhausted." Exhausted didn't begin to cover it. Margaret felt like she was drowning in an ocean of doubt and fear, with no one to pull her out. The breaking point came one night when Margaret was woken by a loud crash. She bolted out of bed, her heart racing, and ran to the source of the noise. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, picture frames shattered on the floor. And in the middle of the chaos stood Ethan, his back to her. "Ethan," she cried, her voice shaking. "What's going on? What happened?" He turned slowly, his face pale and his eyes wide with something between fear and anger. "They're angry," he whispered. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Who's angry?" Ethan's lips trembled, and he took a shaky step toward her. "They don't like it when you try to fight them. They want you to stop." Margaret felt the room spin around her. "Ethan, what are you talking about? Who are they?" Ethan didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker, deeper than they should have been. Margaret stared into the void, her pulse pounding in her ears. For a moment, she thought she saw something shift, a faint, almost imperceptible movement within the darkness. She stumbled back, her mind screaming at her to run, to leave the house, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low and trembling. "They don't like it when you ask questions." Margaret could no longer ignore the gnawing unease, the whispers in the walls, and the creeping sense that her own mind was betraying her. That night, she resolved to uncover the truth. If the boy claiming to be Ethan wasn't her son, then who or what was he? And why was he here? She started in the attic, rummaging through old boxes of family photos and documents, searching for something, anything, that could explain the discrepancies in Ethan's memories. The air was thick with dust, and the dim bulb overhead cast long, flickering shadows as she dug deeper into the past. In a weathered box marked keepsakes, she found the photo albums. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning each image. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, first days of school. Ethan was there in every one, smiling, laughing, growing up before her eyes. But then she turned a page and froze. The next photo was of her standing alone in the backyard, holding a baseball glove. The caption beneath it read, "Ethan's first game, 2010. But there was no Ethan in the picture. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She flipped to the next page and found another photo. This time of her and a neighbor's child at a local park. The caption read, "Ethan and Mom's summer picnic." But again, Ethan wasn't in the frame. The further she looked, the clearer it became. In every photo, every memory she had of her son, something was missing. Sometimes it was as if he had been cropped out. Other times it was subtler, a shadow in the wrong place, an empty chair where she swore he had sat. Margaret's heart pounded as she reached the final album. The last photo was from Ethan's prom night, the night he disappeared. It was the picture she had taken of him standing on the porch in his suit. But now the photo was different. The Ethan in the picture wasn't smiling. His face was blank, his eyes hollow, just like the boy in her living room. Her hands trembled as she flipped the photo over. Written on the back in her own handwriting were the words, "I never had a son." Margaret dropped the album, her mind reeling. She stumbled back, knocking over a stack of boxes. Her memories, were they even real? The bedtime stories, the scraped knees, the hugs and laughter, had it all been fabricated? And if so, by what? Or by who? She confronted Ethan, or the boy who called himself Ethan, later that night. He was sitting at the dining table, staring at his reflection in the window. "I need you to tell me the truth," Margaret said, her voice shaking. "Who are you? Why are you here?" Ethan didn't turn around. "You already know," he said softly. Margaret clenched her fists. "You're not my son. You've never been my son. Tell me what's going on." Ethan finally turned to face her, and for the first time, there was a flicker of emotion in his eyes. Regret. I'm sorry, he whispered. For what? Margaret demanded. What are you sorry for? Ethan stood and walked to the mantel, where a row of family photos sat. He picked one up, a picture of Margaret holding a baby in a hospital bed, and stared at it for a long moment. You made me, he said finally, his voice barely audible. You needed me. Margaret felt her knees weaken. What are you talking about? Ethan turned to her, his expression somber. You were alone. You wanted something to love, something to fill the void. So you created me, and I tried. I tried to be what you needed. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. That's not possible. Think about it, Ethan interrupted. All the moments we shared, all the memories, they don't fit, do they? You always knew something was off, even if you didn't want to see it. Margaret shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. No, you're lying. This isn't real. Ethan stepped in closer, his eyes filled with a sorrow that didn't seem human. It's real, Mom, but I don't belong here anymore. And neither do they. Who are they? Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's gaze shifted to the darkened hallway. The ones who let me stay, the ones who gave me life, but they want something in return. The shadows in the hallway seemed to ripple and swell, growing darker and more oppressive. A low, guttural sound echoed through the house, and the temperature plummeted. Margaret backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. What do they want? She asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan's lips trembled. You. The house felt alive. The walls groaned and pulsed, shadows stretching and recoiling as if breathing. The low, guttural whispers that had once been faint now filled every corner of the room, a chaotic symphony of incomprehensible voices. Margaret pressed herself against the kitchen counter, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she stared at Ethan, or the thing pretending to be Ethan. They're coming, he whispered, his voice trembling. I can't stop them anymore. Margaret's mind reeled, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the floor. What do they want? She demanded, though deep down she already knew. Ethan's eyes glistened with something akin to sorrow. You brought me here, but they paid the price. Now they want you in return. The air around them grew heavier, colder. Margaret's breath puffed in front of her as she edged toward the doorway, her heart pounding. I didn't ask for this. I didn't create you. You did, Ethan said softly. Maybe not with your hands, but with your heart, your grief, your loneliness. I'm sorry, Mom. The words struck her like a physical blow. She wanted to deny it, to scream that it wasn't true, but her memories were a haze of contradictions. Every cherished moment with Ethan was now laced with doubt, with cracks she could no longer ignore. The shadows in the hallway thickened, forming shapes that moved and writhed, their presence pressing against her like a physical weight. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears as she clutched the edge of the counter for support. Don't let them take me, she whispered, her voice breaking. Please, Ethan. Ethan's expression twisted with anguish. I don't have a choice. Neither do you. The house erupted in chaos. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into alternating flashes of blinding light and oppressive darkness. Cabinet doors slammed open and shut, the walls groaning as if they might collapse. The voices grew louder, overlapping in a maddening cacophony. Margaret stumbled back as one of the shadows lunged toward her, its form indistinct but overwhelming in its malice. She screamed as it reached for her, an icy tendril brushing against her arm. The sensation was unbearable, a cold that seeped into her bones, pulling at her very essence. Stop, she cried, her voice drowned out by the chaos. Leave me alone. But the shadows didn't stop. They swirled around her, growing more solid, more oppressive, as if feeding off her fear. Margaret's vision blurred and she collapsed to her knees, clutching her head as the whispers turned into deafening roars. Through the maelstrom, Ethan stood unmoving, his face pale and expressionless. But his eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, were fixed on her. You have to let go, he said, his voice somehow clear amid the chaos. Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't understand. Let go of what? Me, he said simply. You have to let me go, completely. The words hit her like a knife to the heart. I can't, she sobbed. You're my son. You're all I have. I was never your son, he said, his tone gentle but unyielding. You have to let go, or they'll take you instead. Margaret's mind raced. Let him go. How could she let go of the one thing that had kept her going all these years? But the shadows were closing in, their tendrils wrapping around her, pulling her into their suffocating embrace. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice filled with urgency now. "Do it. Say it." Margaret closed her eyes, her heart breaking. "You're not my son," she whispered, the words cutting into her like glass. "You're not my son." The shadows recoiled, their grasp loosening as if the words themselves had driven them back. The house trembled violently, the walls cracking and groaning as the shadows let out a collective wail. Ethan's form began to shift, his features dissolving like smoke in the wind. He stepped closer to her, his expression one of quiet acceptance. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely audible. And then he was gone. The house fell silent. The whispers stopped, the shadows retreated, and the air grew still. Margaret sat on the floor, trembling and broken, her tears falling onto the cold tiles. She was alone, or so she thought. From somewhere deep within the house, a faint creak echoed, a door opening. The silence in the house was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Margaret sat on the cold, cracked tiles of her kitchen floor, her body trembling as she tried to catch her breath. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like an unbearable burden. She forced herself to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady, and looked around the dimly lit room. Everything seemed normal, or as normal as it could be after what she had experienced. The furniture was upright, the photos on the mantel were undisturbed, and the candle Ethan had lit was extinguished, leaving only a faint wisp of smoke curling into the air. But Ethan was gone, completely. The weight of the realization hit her like a freight train. He hadn't just disappeared, he had never been real to begin with. She clung to the counter for support, her mind racing as fragments of memories replayed in her head. Each one felt hollow now, like echoes of a life she had fabricated without even realizing it. She stumbled toward the living room, her breath hitching as her eyes landed on the photo album she had dropped earlier. The last photo, the one from prom night, lay face up on the floor. The image was no longer of Ethan standing on the porch. Now it was just the empty doorway, framed by the faint glow of the porch light. Margaret picked up the photo with trembling hands. Her mind screamed at her to make sense of it, to rationalize what she was seeing, but there was no explanation. No Ethan, no son, nothing. She spent the rest of the night cleaning the house in a daze, trying to push the events out of her mind. By the time the sun rose, the house was spotless, but Margaret felt more unmoored than ever. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the pale light streaming through the window. The quiet suburban street outside looked peaceful, unchanged, as if the horrors of the night had never happened. In the days that followed, Margaret tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. She avoided her neighbors, ignoring their polite smiles and waves. Jessica called several times, but Margaret let the phone ring unanswered. What could she possibly say? How could she explain what had happened? She wasn't sure she even believed it herself. The house felt emptier than ever, its silence oppressive. At night, Margaret swore she could still hear faint whispers, but when she turned on the lights, there was nothing there. The shadows seemed deeper now, lingering in the corners of every room. She avoided looking at them for too long, afraid of what she might see. She began to question everything, her memories, her sanity, even her own identity. If Ethan had never existed, then what did that make her? A grieving mother without a child, or something worse, a person who had lost themselves in the cracks of their own mind? One evening, desperate for some kind of closure, Margaret found herself driving to the woods where Ethan's car had supposedly been found months ago. The place was overgrown, the trees looming high and casting long shadows across the forest floor. She parked the car and stepped out, the cool night air biting at her skin. As she walked through the woods, the memories flooded back. The endless search parties, the nights spent combing through the darkness, calling Ethan's name until her voice was hoarse. But now, those memories felt like a cruel joke. Who had she been searching for? She reached a clearing where a small, dilapidated cabin stood. The structure was barely standing, its roof caved in and its walls warped with age. Margaret didn't remember ever seeing it during the search, but something about it felt familiar, like a half-forgotten dream. Pushing open the rotted door, she stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the floor creaked beneath her weight. In the center of the room was a small wooden table, and on it, a single object, a photograph. Margaret's heart pounded as she approached, her trembling hands reaching for the image. It was a picture of her. She was younger, smiling brightly, holding the hand of a little boy who looked up at her with adoration. The boy wasn't Ethan, he couldn't have been, because Ethan had never existed. But the face was unmistakably the same as the one she had lived with, laughed with, and loved. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you, she whispered into the empty room. The shadows in the cabin seemed to stir, and for a brief moment she thought she heard a faint, familiar voice. "You made me." The photograph slipped from her hands and Margaret turned and fled, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by the encroaching dark. Margaret returned home that night, but she knew she would never find peace. The Ethan-shaped void in her life remained, but it was no longer just grief. It was a haunting, an unresolved question that she would carry with her forever. The house, the woods, the whispers, they all seemed to mock her, reminding her that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. The house was still. Margaret sat in her living room, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. She hadn't slept since her trip to the woods. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the photograph. The boy's face staring back at her, his expression caught between longing and something far darker. She had tried to throw the picture away, but it always found its way back. Once, it was folded neatly on her kitchen counter. Another time, she found it tucked under her pillow. She stopped trying to get rid of it, too exhausted to fight whatever unseen force seemed to have anchored it to her life. Margaret's gaze drifted to the window. The street outside was quiet, the faint glow of porch lights dotting the neighborhood. For a moment, she let herself believe that everything was normal, that the last few weeks had been nothing more than a nightmare born of grief and isolation. But the silence was broken by a soft, rhythmic creak. Her heart seized. The sound was unmistakable, the slow, deliberate creak of the front door opening. She froze, her breath hitching in her chest as her eyes darted to the entryway. The door stood ajar, a sliver of cold night air creeping in, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Margaret rose slowly, her movements cautious, and approached the door. She pushed it open fully, her eyes scanning the darkened street. The faint rustle of leaves in the breeze was the only sound. No one was there. She was about to close the door when she heard it, a voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind. "Mom!" Margaret's blood turned to ice. She stepped out onto the porch, her eyes straining against the darkness. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The street was empty. The voice didn't come again, but as she turned to go back inside, her eyes caught something on the ground near the porch steps. It was a pair of small, muddy footprints leading from the street to her door. Margaret's pulse raced as she backed into the house and locked the door. She leaned against it, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. When she turned around, her heart nearly stopped. The photograph was on the coffee table, though she had left it in the kitchen. This time, the image had changed. Margaret was still there, smiling brightly, but now the boy was gone. In his place was an empty space, and where his hand should have been, in hers, there was a faint, shadowy smudge, like something had been trying to hold on. The lamp flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment. When the light returned, Margaret saw it, just for an instant, in the corner of the room. A shadow, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that glistened faintly in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It only watched. And then it was gone. That night, Margaret lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She didn't dare turn off the light, though it offered little comfort. As she drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, a noise pulled her back to full consciousness, a soft creak. The bedroom door. Margaret sat up slowly, her heart pounding. The door was open, just a crack, the hallway beyond shrouded in darkness. She held her breath, straining to hear, to see, and then, from the shadows, a single word came, whispered so faintly it was almost swallowed by the silence. "Mom?" Margaret didn't scream. She couldn't. The weight of the word, the familiarity of the voice, held her frozen in place. The door creaked open further, the darkness spilling into the room like an ink blot spreading across her reality.